Good morning, everybody. Just a short video today. I wanted to provide you all an update on my summer carrot sowing and germination test. As a refresher, back in the spring, I tested out multiple methods of sowing carrot seeds to see which method would give me the fastest germination and the best germination rates. You can see the results of that test in this video. But I was curious to see how these methods would do when tested in my summer sowing. So here in Ohio, I typically sow a batch of carrots in early spring for a midsummer harvest, and then again in late summer for a fall into winter harvest. And as you can imagine, the challenges of getting carrots started in midsummer are the opposite of an early spring planting. So here in Ohio, I do my late sowing of carrots typically anytime between mid-July and about mid-August for a fall into early winter harvest. Typically during that time of year, the temperatures are quite hot and it can be very, very dry. And if it gets too warm, carrot seed doesn't like to germinate, and it's crucial for good germination to keep that soil moist. So my focus for testing out methods this time of year was anything that would hasten that germination. So I started my test on August 7th. I actually lucked out this year and we had a little stretch of unseasonably cool and drizzly weather right in that week where I started my carrots. Now, it was back up into the 90s the week later, but it did help my carrots get a good start. So for this summer test, these are the methods I decided to test out. Now, first of all, of course, I have my control, and this is just sowing my carrot seeds as I normally would. So I make a very shallow trench, about 1/4 of an inch deep, sow my seed, and then cover lightly with soil. Now, one of the things I typically like to do with carrots is rather than cover with soil, I cover with earthworm castings. I didn't have any sitting around this time, so I just used soil. And then I water everything in well. Next, I tested burlap. So I sowed the seed as normal and then covered the planting area with a piece of wet burlap. Next, I tested out the board method, and this is actually a method that my grandparents used back when they were gardening. Similar to the burlap method, I simply planted my carrot seeds as normal, watered, and then covered with a board. With both the board and the burlap, I wanted to be sure to remove those as soon as I saw the first sign of carrots sprouting. Next was the mini greenhouse method. Now, I didn't actually think that this would help with summer sowings, but I tested it in the spring and wanted to see what happened in the summer as well. So for this one, I sowed my carrot seeds as normal, watered, and then placed a small mini greenhouse. And this is just basically a piece of clear plastic with some vents in it over the planting area. Next, I tested shade cloth. For this, I sowed my seed as normal, watered, and then covered the area with a shade cloth draped over hoops. I'm not actually sure what percentage of shade this worked out to. This was actually just an old repurposed piece of shade cloth that I took off of a grow tunnel and doubled over on itself. Just eyeballing it, this looks pretty close to my typical 40% shade cloth that I use throughout the garden. And then I just pinned this into place with a few garden fabric pins to keep it secure. Of course, I had to retest out the cornstarch gel method. Now, this was a method that I tried in the spring and wasn't super happy with the results, so I tweaked things a little bit for my summer sowing. For the cornstarch seed gel, I started by soaking my carrot seeds in water overnight. The next morning, I prepared my cornstarch gel. So I used 2 tablespoons of cornstarch mixed into a cup of water, and I mixed the cornstarch into the water in a saucepan and brought that mixture to a simmer until the mixture started to gel. Then I let this gel cool completely and then mixed in a little less than a tablespoon of seed. This was the part that I tweaked. I ended up using about half the amount of seed mixed into the gel as compared to my first spring sowing. I mixed those seeds into the cornstarch gel well, and then poured that whole mixture into a Ziploc type bag. Out in the garden, I prepared a narrow furrow about 1/4 of an inch deep, snipped a small hole in the corner of the Ziploc bag, and then squeezed the cornstarch gel and seeds evenly into the furrows. Then this was lightly covered with soil and watered well. And then my final test method was pre-germinating carrot seed. Now, if you saw the spring video, you saw that I tested out pre-germinated seed planted into the garden on a paper towel. I wasn't happy with that method, so this time I just planted the pre-germed seed directly into my garden beds. To pre-germinate the carrot seed, I again let the seed soak overnight. For this, you don't have to soak them overnight, just do a minimum of a couple of hours at least. I then strained the water off of my seed and sprinkled onto a pre-moistened paper towel. I like to put the paper towels onto a cutting board or a plate or something sturdier because it makes this a lot easier. Sprinkled the seed on top of that paper towel and then tried to get the seed into as close to a single layer as possible. Then I covered all the seed up with another pre-moistened paper towel or two, and then slide everything into a Ziploc style bag and don't shut the bag. I check the seeds every couple of days, making sure to mist those paper towels with water if they start to dry out. And as soon as those seeds start to sprout, I move them out to the garden. Now, I actually ended up waiting a couple days too long to plant this time. I started these seeds on the 7th and I planted on the 12th. I probably should have gone a day or two earlier. And this is because by the time I planted the seeds, they were actually starting to put little roots down into the paper towel, which made it very difficult to remove them without damaging the little sprouts. So to be very, very careful when I planted these into the garden. These I planted just like my other carrot seeds, made my little trench, placed them in the rows, and then lightly covered with soil and watered in. Now, once I had all of my tests out here, I did make sure to water this lightly every second to third day. And that was just to keep the top couple inches of the soil surface moist. That is the crucial part of getting carrot seed to germinate, especially in the heat. You don't want this soil surface to dry out. Now, on to the good part. What were my actual results? So I started planting on the 7th, and by the 12th, I was seeing the very first of my sprouts. Seeds were sprouting underneath my burlap and my board. Seeds under the shade cloth were sprouting. I had a few sprouts in my control plantings and 2 sprouts underneath my mini greenhouse. By the 15th, all of the seeds were germinated under the shade cloth and germination rates looked really good in there. More sprouts were up in the control plantings and under the mini greenhouse, and 2 sprouts were up in my cornstarch gel row. By the 20th of August, all seeds have germinated in my control groups and under the mini greenhouse. The seeds that were planted under the board and the burlap are all up and look great. And at this point, I can tell that the groups planted under the shade cloth and under the board appear to have the very best germination rates and growth. The others are a bit spotty. I have areas where seeds never germinated. All of the seeds in the cornstarch gel row are now up, and I'm happy to say that reducing the amount of seed added to the mixture definitely helped with my earlier issues of having a lot of seeds clump up in areas together. Most of my pre-germinated seeds are up now too. Pre-germinating gives me a huge advantage when planting in the early spring when soil temperatures are still cool. But for these summer sowings, it honestly appears to be a bit of a waste of time. Many of my direct sown seeds were sprouted and up before I even got these moved out of the house and into the garden. So today, which I'm filming this on September 16th, just a little over a month after the first of these seeds were sown, let's look at what I've got going on in this bed. My control plot, as well as those which were under the board, burlap, and shade cloth, are all about the same size and doing well. Those which were under the greenhouse are about the same size also, but sadly, I've only got a few left. Something was getting in here and nibbling off carrot greens, and I didn't catch it right away. When I noticed, I stuck a few hoops in and covered this bed with insect netting pinned into the soil, and that seemed to stop whomever the culprit was. My cornstarch gel seedlings here are slightly smaller, but I'm pleased with the overall germination. And then my pre-germed seedlings here. This was interesting. All of these were up and growing, and then as I mentioned earlier, the weather got really hot again, and these just seemed to fry up in the heat. I didn't have that issue with any of the other plantings. So while I'll stick to pre-germing seed in the spring, definitely not doing it for summer sowings. So what are my big takeaways here? I've used the board method before. Like I mentioned, this was a method that my grandparents used and my dad used in the garden, but it was really neat to actually see it tested out against all of these other methods in a control, and rewarding to see that it actually worked. Like so many tidbits handed down from great-grandparents and grandparents, it's a lot of useful knowledge there. Going forward, I will definitely be using the board method again, as well as covering seed with shade cloth. What I will most likely end up doing for the future is covering the planting area with a board just till those seeds germinate, at which point I will then cover the area with my shade cloth and just allow that to cover my carrot seedlings until the weather cools down a little bit, usually after mid to late September here. Now my next step, I've got to get all of this bare exposed soil mulched with grass clippings. That's going to help keep my soil cool and moist and ensure that my carrots that have survived do well and taste delicious. So I'm gonna get on that task. In the meantime, if you have a method of sowing carrot seeds that you love, drop a line in the comments below and let me know about it. And if you enjoyed today's video, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.